It's really my honor to introduce Dr. Georgette Bennett, who is, I will move over so you can see her, and hopefully we'll have a full screen in a minute, or maybe. Georgette is really one of the pioneers who has been working on this issue. Georgette and I actually first talked about this issue in July of 2013. So way before this became headline news. Georgette, I think, had just been to a refugee camp in Jordan. You can tell more about that story, and was describing the catastrophe that was taking place in our time and the needs. And at that time, the Leichtag Foundation was very admiring of the work that Georgette had done in then founding the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, that we gave a grant to that effort at that time. Georgette is a leader and a philanthropist, activist. Her bio is at your places. She is, I know she's presented in many different forums about this issue. She's joining us today from New York. She's a true pioneer. We're really honored to have her with us today. Georgette will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to do some question and answer with her. So with that, Georgette, you're on.
Thank you very much, Charlene. I'm very honored to have been invited to address all of you. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in the room with you, and I hope you're able to hear me. Can you let me know, because
Yes.
I'm on a speaker?
You're great.
Thank you. I like that sum up. So I'm an enormous admirer and fan of both Charlene and the Leichtag Foundation. Always very forward-looking, and it's just typical of them that they would have organized a meeting like this with so many important people in the room. But you know, it doesn't matter where you speak, even if you're just on video conference. Have you noticed that nobody ever wants to sit near the speaker? That whole center table. And I'm 3,000 miles away. What harm can I do? Anyway, I'm very glad that there are also some members and associates of the Multifaith Alliance who are in the room. ADL is a member of the Multifaith Alliance, and Catholic Relief Services, which is associated with Catholic Charities. Glad that you're represented in the room, and the International Rescue Committee, where I have had the honor of serving on both the board initially and now as an overseer. And it's really IRC that got me started in terms of my interest in this issue. In January of 2013, the International Rescue Committee issued a report on the Syrian crisis. And being a typical overextended New Yorker, and to my everlasting shame, that report sat on my desk for 5 months before I had a chance to read it. But when I finally read it, it had an enormously powerful effect on me. I could not get Leviticus 19:16 out of my brain. It just kept reverberating. Thou shalt not stand by idly while the blood of your brothers cries out from the earth. And as a child of Holocaust survivors and as a refugee myself, along with my parents, I truly could not stand by idly while this horrific crisis was taking place. So I founded the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, and I hope that one of the things that you'll do at the end of this program is that you will decide to join the Multifaith Alliance so that we can all stand together. We are currently made up of 53 organizations, most of them faith-based, but also a number of secular organizations. And the more of us stand together, the more we can use the power of the collective to help ameliorate this terrible crisis. So what I'd like to do is I would like to start by giving you an overview of the situation. And I know that we want to do about 15 minutes of me presenting and 45 minutes of Q&A. And if there's still some time in my 15 minutes of presenting to talk about some specific things that we can do in the U.S. In terms of urban refugees, in terms of the refugee camps in Europe and in Canada, I would like to do that. If not, I'm sure we can get some of that covered during the Q&A. So thanking you very, very much for your interest in this important issue. I'm going to start with a brief overview and a brief PowerPoint presentation. So let me start with the crisis in numbers. It's even worse than what Charlene shared with you. There, in fact, are now about 300,000 Syrians who have been killed, and some even estimate that the number is as high as 500,000. The life expectancy in Syria has dropped by 30% in only a 5-year period. It's extraordinary. 80% of Syria has fallen into poverty, and it has dropped way down on the World Development Index. There are 12.2 million people who are in urgent need of aid in Syria, either because they have been displaced or because they are under siege. And as Charlene correctly pointed out, this is more than half of Syria's population. There are more than 4 million registered refugees. These are just the registered ones. There are hundreds of thousands of others who are not registered. And even though all of the video that we're seeing is of the refugees who were flooding into Europe, it's important to recognize two things. Number one, all of those refugees are not Syrians. And number two, the vast majority of the refugees are in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. So relatively few have gone to Europe. 80% of the refugees are women and children, and half of them are under 18. This has important implications in terms of what kind of aid we deliver and how we focus that aid. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees is the agency that is charged with delivering direct aid, with running the refugee camps, with identifying the most vulnerable refugees, and registering refugees. UNHCR right now is completely overwhelmed, and it is completely underfunded. There is a funding gap of 55% in terms of what UNHCR needs to do its job and what it has actually received. The situation in Europe, which has been dominating the media, at least dominating the media since the body of the Syrian toddler washed up on a beach in Turkey, that unfortunately is what it took for the world to wake up. So there are more than 680,000 Syrian applications for asylum in Europe, and at least 1 million are expected by the end of this year, and the end of this year is almost here. More than 3,400 people have died trying to cross into Europe, and 2/3 of the refugees who are going to Europe are men. Now this creates a very misleading picture because it gives you the impression that most of the refugees are men and intact families. But in fact, the ones who you see in these pictures, these were taken by by the Multifaith Alliance's person on the ground who was in Syria and in Macedonia. you have to remember that the ones who undertake this crossing are the ones who are the most fit, who are the strongest, and who have the resources to pay the smugglers who bring them in. But this is the way that they're living, in these temporary makeshift tents made out of blankets, made out of plastic sheeting. You see these children, and this is very important because more than 2 million Syrian children have been out of school for a long period of time now. And if we don't do something to rescue these children, if we don't do something to get them back into school, then what we are doing is sowing the seeds of future extremists, because they will be vulnerable to manipulation and to radicalization. And there you see an infant. In terms of resettlement, the UNHCR has asked for 130,000 to be resettled worldwide. And that represents, the way it usually works is that UNHCR asks for 10% of the refugees to be resettled. In this case, we're talking about 400,000. The U.S. usually would take about 100,000. But as you know, the U.S. has committed to taking only 10,000. And that's actually less than we had committed to a couple of years ago. So this is actually a lower quota. We had committed to 25,000 over a 2-year period in 2013 and 2014, but only 2,100 Syrian refugees have been resettled in the U.S. since the start of the conflict. Now, we're hearing, as Charlene mentioned, a lot of rhetoric about the threat of terrorists sneaking in with the refugees. And so we now have a bill pending before the Senate, which has been passed by the House, the SAFE Act, which would in effect shut down the resettlement of refugees, Syrian refugees, in the U.S. But here is the reality about the threat. Of the 784,000 refugees who have been resettled in the U.S. since 9/11, only 2 have been charged with terrorist activities. And of the 2,100 Syrians that have been resettled in the U.S., none have been arrested in relation to settlement activities. Now, this isn't surprising because, as you're probably aware, or you certainly are aware by now because it's gotten plenty of publicity, the screening process that the U.S. uses to resettle refugees is a very, very thorough security clearance process. And it's very difficult for a refugee to be admitted. I can't imagine why any terrorist in their right mind would want to go through that process and risk exposure when there are so much easier ways to infiltrate the U.S. There are big roadblocks to resettlement in the U.S. And in order for it to work more efficiently without compromising the security criteria that we use, there are a number of things that we need to do. Certainly our goal should be to accelerate resettlement in the U.S. So one of the things that needs to be done is to have Congress allocate more funding to the Department of Homeland Security and the other agencies that are involved in doing the vetting. Because right now there aren't enough personnel to do it. Each of the agencies uses a different algorithm in order to make its determinations. And that slows down the process tremendously. So it's very important to establish a uniform protocol and standard criteria across agencies. U.S. law does not require that we take our refugee referrals only from the UN. We can take them from NGOs like the International Rescue Committee that have enormous expertise. But those NGOs have to go through a certification process by the State Department, which involves some very basic training. But the State Department has not held one of these trainings since 2007. And yet it would be a big help if we could have NGOs make referrals, including bulk referrals, rather than single case referrals, which is a process that is being done now. Now, it's also important to prioritize the most vulnerable refugees, who are women and children. They're also least likely to be a security risk. And another group that we ought to be prioritizing is medical workers. Attacks on medical workers and medical facilities have become used as a weapon of war in Syria. As a result, 15,000 doctors have fled Syria. And when we think about all of the underserved communities in the U.S. that don't have access to medical care, it becomes very, very useful for us to try to bring in some of these highly skilled Syrian doctors who fled only because they could no longer work safely in Syria. So this is kind of an overview of the situation as it stands. Now, you might ask, with this bill pending before Congress, and we're going to know this week whether or not the Senate is going to approve it. You might ask, what can we do in the meantime? Because it looks as if resettlement in the U.S. is going to be a problem. So let me just give you a very quick overview without details. We can get into more detail in the Q&A in terms of what you can be doing now in the absence of resettlement. One of the very important things to do is to do counter-messaging, to respond to the horrific hate-mongering, fear-mongering, anti-refugee rhetoric that we're hearing now. For example, one might work with the anti-hate table, which consists of groups like the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, ADL, you're in the room, and ADL is working with the anti-hate table, ACLU, America's Voice, American Immigration Council. It would be very useful for philanthropists to fund social media campaigns that provide facts to counter the xenophobia and the Islamophobia that we're seeing now. And it would be very useful for those of you who are not philanthropists to make use of your social media that your organization uses to counter the anti-refugee rhetoric, because that, after all, is what's at the core of the political problems that we're seeing now. It's also very important, And this comes to me from a conversation I had with the U.S. Regional Director for UNHCR. This is the time to work at the local level. And the fact that you in San Diego are coming together as a group of diverse organizations is exactly what's needed right now, because now is the time to engage in local advocacy in a more concentrated way. For example, engaging faith leaders to prepare the ground for the arrival of refugees and to counter the xenophobia and the Islamophobia, to lobby your elected officials, your mayor in San Diego, to model world relief good neighbor teams, for example, teams that supplement the government services during a refugee's transition period, to encourage employers to supplement resettlement funding, to advise local resettlement offices of people who are offering their homes, who are offering jobs, who are offering other kinds of services, who are doing what the Leichtag Foundation wants to do in terms of bringing Syrian agricultural workers to work in their agricultural operations. And by the way, a very large percentage of the Syrians who are in the largest refugee camp, the Zatari camp in Jordan, come from Dara, which is a very heavily agricultural area. Education. There is a great need for language classes, for remedial education, because we're dealing with people, children who, as I said earlier, have missed years of schooling. Higher education, that's something that's almost out of reach for Syrians right now. And so to fund scholarships, to bring them in with student visas, which means they don't have to go through this very, very difficult screening process. And universities that are used to international students have everything in place that they need, but we need funds to provide scholarships for Syrian students. And this will do us some good also, because these are Syrians who are getting a Western education. And if they ever go back to Syria, these will be the future leaders. And if they don't go back to Syria, they will be contributing members of our society. Now I just want to turn to urban refugees, because as I said earlier, urban refugees make up 80% of the Syrian population, the Syrian refugee population. And these urban refugees are living under terrible conditions. They are very vulnerable. They are essentially squatters. They don't have access to the services that those in camps have. Paying for housing is extremely difficult because the demand is so high that housing costs have skyrocketed. They're not able to find legal jobs. In terms of the women, 1/3 of the women of the families with children are female-headed households with no income. There is a wave of early marriages, number one, to prevent young women to protect them from rape, supposedly, but they're being married off so young that they are being raped, but they're being raped by their husbands instead of by strangers. And this is also a death sentence for some of these young women, because the biggest cause of death in that age group is childbirth. So when they give birth early, often they end up dying in the process. Many of these women have sold their gold in order to escape and in order to survive. There's been an increase in domestic violence, and these women feel very shamed by their circumstances, and so they generally don't step forward. For the men, they are working illegally and therefore subject to exploitation with no recourse. Many of them suffer from depression and shame because their sons cannot continue their education. They have feelings of uselessness. Children, 60% are not attending school. In many cases because of bullying, in other cases because of an inability to catch up after missing years of school, and many have trouble adjusting to the Jordanian curriculum, those of them who are in Jordan. 100% of them have no safe spaces to play, and many of them are working in order to help support their families. So the greatest needs for the urban refugees are funding to make up the monthly shortfall between income and expenses, to have safe housing, access to medical care, psychosocial services. This is a highly traumatized population. Human rights protection, education. So how can the philanthropic community help? Well, monthly cash assistance, pop-up cash assistance, emergency cash assistance, non-food items, such as household goods for those who have fled with nothing, vocational training, psychosocial activities and trauma treatment, and services for women. And the IRC has been especially effective in terms of providing special services for women, and the IRC representative who is there, I'm sure, can talk to you further about that. One program that has been very, very effective is the IRC Cash Card program. And this has been tried in Lebanon, where there are no refugee camps. All of the refugees are urban refugees. They're scattered among 1,200 towns in Lebanon. And the way the IRC Cash Card program worked is that each refugee was provided with a reloadable debit card that would provide them with $200 a month for the refugees to spend on necessities of their choice. And IRC, which does data-driven work, when they evaluated the program, found that the cash card families had more frequent and more plentiful meals, that they were 50% less likely to put their children to work and more likely to send their children to school. There was absolutely no evidence that the cash was being spent irresponsibly, no evidence that it was spent on alcohol or tobacco. And in addition to that, it benefited the host communities because there was money circulating in the host communities, which of course would reduce the resentment against the refugees. I could talk to you about the conditions in the camps and what I see as the greatest needs there, as well as Europe and Canada, but I think what I would like to do now is stop. You're welcome to ask me about those things during the Q&A, but I would like to just open it up now for questions. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Georgette. We so appreciate your leadership. You're such an important resource to us in this area. I think because of our complicated setup here, audio setup, I'm going to repeat questions that come in from the audience so we're sure that you hear them. And I'm not going to use a microphone. I'm just going to talk loudly. And I think I'll just ask the first question, though. You alluded before, but I'd like you to just speak a little bit more specifically about the Senate bill, the congressional action that will take place this week, you believe. Can you give a little bit more detail? What is that and what will result? What may result?
Well, the bill, in effect, requires the head of the Department of Homeland Security, the head of the FBI, and also the head of one agency that's deeply involved in security screening to personally approve of each refugee that is being considered considered for resettlement in the U.S. Now, with the current procedures, it already takes between 18 months and 2 years to get through that process. And with these additional hurdles that are being proposed, it could take up to 5 years.
And that will be voted on this week. Congress passed it, right? The House passed it, and the Senate.
The House passed the bill, and it's going to the Senate this week.
Right. And we've been told that there's a few possibilities that the Senate could either pass it, which would essentially stop the refugee process, that they could propose an alternative bill, which we understand may be being worked on by members of the House, or they could choose not to take it up. So there may be other discussion of that. Norma, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that
Okay.
because it's connected. There's also other folks, we have a Washington Legislative Office that think that there's conversations about them including it in the omnibus bill, I can't pronounce that, but the spending bill. And if that happens, then it might move faster than we think. So it's just moving in all kinds of different ways.
That's correct. One of the good things that's happening, though, is that a conversation has begun that perhaps this is a misplaced focus, the refugees. And what Congress should really be looking at is our visa waiver process, which makes it much easier to get into the country than the already very rigorous process to which refugees are subject. And you should know that it's not just the process that we have here in the U.S. Any refugee has to first be screened by UNHCR. UNHCR then makes referrals to the U.S. We then have our own immigration officers going to the sites where the refugees are and interviewing them there on site. And only then does the refugee enter the pipeline in terms of the very rigorous process we have in the U.S. At the moment, the U.S. is conducting interviews in Jordan and in Turkey, but not in Lebanon.
Okay, thank you, Georgette. I just want to also point out that we're videotaping today's session, so if you can just say your name and where you're from when you ask a question. Also, everything that Georgette shared, which were very helpful, action steps will be on the video, and we'll be posting the video online, so just be aware of that as well. So I'd like to open it up to your questions. Well, you answered everything? Mo.
Mo Winnicky, Anti-Defamation League. Can you hear me?
I'll repeat the question if she doesn't.
I can hear him.
Great.
I see a root cause for this whole refugee situation as poor governance in so many countries. In the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf and in South Asia, there are pluralistic societies and very non-inclusive governments. The crisis in Syria started as a public uprising. This has the potential of happening in so many other places. Now, this may be a rhetoric question because it's too big a question, but how can we prevent more tragedies?
I don't think that Charlene included Secretary of State in my bio when she introduced me.
I should have.
Look, I think the only way that we can prevent more tragedies by responding properly to this one. We certainly, as civil society actors, cannot do anything about the governments in the Middle East. Most of them have already gone through their revolutions and their evolutions, but the Syrian crisis is certainly the worst of them. I think there are some hopeful signs in terms of the Syrian crisis. since Russia has stepped into the game, although I think that it's most unfortunate that they are focusing their military campaign on moderate opposition rather than ISIS. The fact that Russia is there has brought Iran to the table so that Iran, the U.S., and Russia can now talk to each other about this, and that there are some proposals on the table to deal with the political situation in Syria. I think it's very important that those three parties speak, because what's going on in Syria is really a proxy war. The military campaign in Syria is not really a Syrian campaign. It's an Iranian campaign. It's the Iranian National Guard that is in there and that is running it. So this situation is not going to get resolved without bringing Iran to the table. Russia, of course, is another actor with a big stake, not because Putin is a lover or admirer of Assad, but because Russia is very much afraid of, après moi le déluge, what follows Assad. With its enormous Muslim population, Russia is very much afraid of extremism spreading to Russia. So that's Russia's interest in the game. And the U.S., of course, we know what our interest is. So I think it's very important that these three nations are speaking to each other.
I also just want to add that there are some very compelling arguments that show climate change as and scarce resources as a driver of the refugee crisis. And I think, you talk about it, that we're going to be seeing more climate change refugees as time goes by. So that's very, very important in terms of funding, water work and natural resource development in the area. Otherwise, climate change is going to really impact the region. I think, Georgette, I'll ask you the next question. Can you describe a little bit about the refugee camps and what the needs are in the camps specifically?
Yes, so only 20% of the refugees actually live in camps. And if you take Zaatari as an example, Zaatari is the second largest refugee camp in the world, and it is now the fourth largest city in Jordan. You have overcrowding. It was never built to hold the 81,000 refugees who it's now holding. We've heard a lot of reports of violence in the camps, gender violence, among other things. But the camps in Jordan, and I'm focusing on Jordan because, as I said earlier, Lebanon doesn't have formal refugee camps. Turkey has a great many of them, but Turkey is quite well resourced, and it has set up really model refugee camps. So that really does leave us with Jordan. While it's true that there are about 130,000 refugees in Egypt, relative to the other numbers, that's not a lot. So in Jordan, the camps are subject to Jordanian law, and they are policed by Jordan. Community policing has been introduced and outsourced to a reliable outside agency. It's a very good one. The name is Syrian. And it's a very service-oriented form of policing. Of course, it required a great deal of building of trust to get the refugees to deal with the police, because, of course, they come from a country where the police are not your friends. But the colonel who runs the policing service in Zaatari very proudly told me that he had received hundreds of complaints about gender violence. And he took this to be a very good sign that the refugees, the victims, were willing to come forward and willing to deal with the police. The way that the police stations are set up is that there are private rooms so that the refugees can speak openly and comfortably. And there seems to be an attempt to be very sensitive in those situations. But if the refugees are not permitted to set foot outside the camp, literally set foot outside the camp, lest they risk deportation, the only circumstances under which they can leave the camps are if they are bailed out by a Jordanian. Usually this would be to do seasonal work. But Jordan is very concerned about the refugees competing with Jordanians for scarce economic resources, for scarce jobs. Jordan's infrastructure is on the verge of collapse, and the whole country is on the verge of being destabilized because of the enormous drain of not only the Syrian refugees. That's the largest group. That's one of the largest groups. But remember, this is on top of 2 million Palestinian refugees who've been there for decades, and about 400,000 Iraqis who are still there. And now, according to King Abdullah, there are 1.4 million Syrian refugees in Jordan. Now, Jordan is one of the countries where a refugee is not legally permitted to work, except inside the camps, where refugees are permitted to work. And this, I think, is a real opportunity for funding, because when I was in Zatari, there is a main street that runs the entire length of the camp. It is an enormous, enormous camp, and they called that street the Champs-Élysées because there used to be a French medical facility in that area. And the Champs-Élysées is lined on both sides, as far as the eye can see, with shops and cafes and restaurants. Now, these aren't glamorous places. They're really ramshackle. The refugees who have started these small businesses have just taken whatever leftover construction material happened to be lying around. And you can buy anything you can think of in these shops. Everything from toilet seats to very fancy evening gowns to electronics. And you might wonder, how can these businesses be sustained? Well, bear in mind that every refugee gets a monthly allowance, and that there are thousands of aid workers who are working in this camp, including the IRC, and they too need to buy a cup of coffee over the course of the day. So you have a cash economy circulating around the camp, which I've been told, and this number is completely unverified, nobody's been able to verify it, of about $14 million a month. But what a wonderful thing that these refugees have an opportunity to regain their dignity. And let's remember what an important thing dignity is in Arab culture, much, much more important than in Western culture. One of the reasons that the refugees in the camps don't like refugee tourists, all of us do-gooders who come to the camp in order to, do an inspection, see what their situation is, they don't like that because they feel humiliated by their circumstances. But if they can start a business, if they can generate some income, if they can send some remittances back to family in Syria, what a wonderful gift that is. So this is an opportunity for philanthropists to create a fund or to do microfinancing, although microfinancing is a tough thing to do when there's no accountability and it's a cash economy. But there is a wonderful opportunity that nobody has really thought about to help refugees in the camps start small businesses. There are schools in the camps. but children are not required to attend them. But there certainly is a need for books, even if children are not attending the camps. They can learn in their homes, in the caravans, in the tents. So this too is an opportunity. There are a couple of dozen NGOs that are providing services in the refugee camps. All of them need your support so that they can keep on doing what they're doing.
Georgette,
And
I know our time with you is limited, so I want to see if we have one more question. Tony?
Yeah, I'm Tony Kranz. I'm on the Encinitas City Council, and I wanted to say how impressed I am with your passion for and commitment to this issue, and the fact that you are actually walking the talk of your faith. And so I really appreciate that. Earlier you mentioned the idea of lobbying local elected officials, and I was wondering, we have a 3-minute opportunity for people to speak during oral communications at our city council meetings. And if you were to come to our council meeting next week and speak on this issue, what is it you would say to the elected officials?
Good question.
Very good question. So the first thing I would focus on is the need to counter the anti-refugee rhetoric, because this is extraordinarily destructive. And it's going to influence everything, not just resettlement, but people's willingness to support these refugees wherever they are. There are very well-funded websites that are generating all of the fear-mongering and xenophobia. We have to counter that. So that's a very high priority. And to the extent that the city of San Diego is willing to engage in a citywide campaign that counters this, that would be a high priority.
And
we
also have a few NGOs in the room that I know are working on this, like the ACLU, Equality Alliance, the ADL, and others that are working on this very issue locally.
Yes, that needs to go citywide. So that would be
Countywide.
a high priority. Countywide. You're a county and a city.
Or many cities.
And in terms of the rest, I think resettlement is going to slow down to a trickle. There are 9 resettlement agencies in the U.S. That cover a total of about 143 areas in the U.S. The IRC, I think, has 24. Am I right about that? 24 resettlement offices across the country. And
we have 2 of them in this room. I think there are 4 locally. Is that right?
4. There's 3 of us in the room.
3. Oh, 3
Yeah.
in the room. IRC, JFS, and Catholic Charities. Great.
right. And LEARS, the Lutheran organization, has 43 across the country. So to the extent that there are going to be any refugees to resettle, it's very important to coordinate with those resettlement organizations. But because I'm afraid it's going to slow down to a trickle for a while to come, maybe what the city and county of San Diego can do, and an idea to give to the city council, is to adopt a location where the refugees are on site now, whether it's Greece or Macedonia, or whether it's in one of the refugee camps or an urban area in Jordan or Lebanon. It seems to me like just the way that we adopt sister cities for other purposes, one might adopt a sister area for purposes of focusing aid for refugees. So those are just a couple of thoughts in terms of how I would use my 3 minutes if I were testifying before the city council.
Thank you so much, Georgette. before we have a discussion, we're gonna say goodbye to Georgette. We really thank you again, and Javier's gonna help us with that, right? Thank you. And before we have a before we go to the brainstorming part of our discussion, Georgette mentioned the resettlement